Henry Calloway was a man who had spent most of his life in the city, surrounded by the constant hum of traffic, fluorescent lights, and endless schedules. Now, in the quiet solitude of his early 70s, he found himself yearning for a life stripped of noise, a life where the only companions were the wind, the trees, and the occasional bird overhead. The relentless pace of urban existence had left him exhausted, and grief over the loss of his wife, Margaret, made every familiar street and corner in the city feel hollow and oppressive. In a moment of bold decision, he purchased an old ranch several hours away, nestled deep in the forested hills of Lone Creek Valley. It was a place that had been abandoned for decades, its history fading into obscurity, but to Henry, it represented the chance for a new beginning, a life unshackled from the chaos he had long endured. When Henry arrived, the ranch was everything he expected and more. The main house leaned slightly to one side, its wooden siding bleached by years of sun and rain. The windows were dusty, some broken, and the porch sagged as though it were weary from carrying decades of untold stories. Rusted tools lay scattered across the overgrown barnyard, tangled among weeds that had claimed the once tended fields. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the air, mingling with the faint, almost imperceptible aroma of pine from the surrounding forest. For Henry, the desolation was not off-putting, it was liberating. Here, he thought, no one could judge him, no one could demand anything of him. The first days were quiet and solitary. Henry wandered the property, exploring its hidden corners and imagining the lives that had once unfolded there. He traced the faded outlines of old fences, stepped cautiously through a small orchard overrun with wild growth, and discovered a dry creek bed where sunlight danced on the stones in shifting patterns. As the sun dipped behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the land, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't known in years. Yet even in this solitude, there was a subtle unease. Strange tracks appeared in the mud near the edge of the forest, tracks that did not belong to any farm animal Henry recognized. At night, distant howls echoed through the valley, sending a shiver down his spine. They were eerie but also strangely inviting, as though the forest itself were alive, waiting for him to truly become part of it. Henry's routine began to take shape. He cleared the overgrown pathways, started a small vegetable garden, and fixed the leaky roof of the main house. Each task gave him a sense of purpose, a rhythm to his days that contrasted sharply with the unending noise of city life. Yet, beneath the satisfaction of rebuilding his new life, there lingered a whisper of something unknown. The ranch, with all its decay and abandonment, seemed to harbor secrets that would soon reveal themselves in ways Henry could never have anticipated. As he lay awake the first night, listening to the forest breathe around him, he realized that his quiet retreat might not be as solitary as he had imagined. Somewhere out there, in the shadows of the towering trees, a presence watched him, curious and untamed. By the end of his first week, Henry's sense of isolation had evolved into a mix of anticipation and wonder. The abandoned ranch was no longer just a place of escape, it was a threshold, the beginning of a journey that would challenge his understanding of life, loneliness, and what it truly meant to belong. A week into his stay at the Lone Creek Ranch, Henry felt a growing sense of connection to the land. The once neglected fields were slowly taking shape under his hands, and the silence of the forest no longer felt empty but full of life. Yet, with that life came a strange, almost electric tension. On his second evening, as the sun dipped behind the western hills and shadows lengthened across the overgrown pastures, Henry noticed movement at the edge of the forest, a flicker of motion among the thick underbrush. At first, he thought it was a deer or a coyote. But then he saw her, a girl not more than 12 or 13, moving with a grace and alertness that seemed almost unnatural. What startled Henry most wasn't just her appearance, but the way she carried herself. Every movement was precise, instinctual, and fluid, as though she were part of the forest itself. Henry froze, unsure whether to approach or retreat. The girl did not run. She stood still for a moment, tilting her head slightly as if assessing him, her eyes sharp and bright like a wild animal's. Behind her, a pack of wolves emerged from the shadows, their movements silent and coordinated. They didn't growl or bare their teeth, but there was no mistaking the warning in their gaze. These creatures clearly recognized the girl as one of their own and were ready to defend her without hesitation. For Henry, fear and awe collided in equal measure. He realized that this girl had lived in this forest for years, surviving in a way he could barely comprehend. She seemed completely at home in the wilderness, moving and communicating with the wolves as if they were extensions of her own being. The sight was mesmerizing and terrifying. A child raised by wolves, untamed and unafraid, a creature of instinct and raw intelligence. The girl stepped closer, holding a small bundle, perhaps food she had gathered. She crouched low, almost like a wolf herself, and set the bundle down on the ground before glancing back at her pack. The wolves responded with soft whines and low growls, then settled into a cautious circle around her. Henry wanted to speak, to reassure her he meant no harm, but he knew any sudden movement could provoke the pack. He remained still, watching the silent exchange, feeling both a pang of loneliness and a spark of fascination. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she vanished into the forest, the wolves following her without a sound. The moment left Henry shaken. He returned to his house that night with his mind racing, imagining the girl and her pack moving through the dark trees like shadows. Who was she? How had she survived alone in the wilderness for so long? And most importantly, what did her presence mean for him in this lonely, abandoned ranch? For the first time since arriving, Henry felt a pulse of anticipation beneath his usual solitude. The forest was no longer just a backdrop for his retreat. It was alive with secrets, and he had glimpsed one of its deepest mysteries. The girl and her wolves were a living enigma, challenging his understanding of human connection, trust, and the untamed world that lay just beyond the edge of his newfound home. That night, as he listened to distant howls echoing through the valley, Henry realized that his life at Lone Creek Ranch would never be ordinary and that the forest had something extraordinary waiting for him. After his first startling encounter with the wild girl and her wolf pack, Henry found himself both haunted and fascinated. Sleep came fitfully that night, his mind replaying every detail of her movements, her piercing gaze, and the eerie silence that accompanied the wolves. By morning, the curiosity he felt had grown into an almost irresistible urge to learn more. But he knew approaching her directly could provoke the pack and possibly endanger both himself and the girl. So he resolved to observe her from a distance, learning the rhythms of her life in the forest without intruding. Henry began exploring the surrounding woods at different times of day, carefully keeping out of sight while following faint trails she seemed to favor. He watched her from behind trees and rocks, noticing how she moved as though the forest itself guided her steps. She climbed steep slopes with the ease of a mountain cat, waded through streams without hesitation, and vanished into the brush in a single swift motion when threatened by a passing deer or the sudden call of a distant bird. The wolves were never far from her side, but Henry soon realized that they didn't merely follow her, they listened to her, obeyed her signals, and even appeared to communicate with subtle gestures as if she were their pack leader. Through these observations, Henry began piecing together her story. She was clearly intelligent and resourceful, capable of hunting small game, foraging edible plants, and constructing temporary shelters from branches and leaves. Yet she also displayed moments of profound vulnerability, pausing at night to look at the stars with a quiet longing that reminded Henry painfully of his own solitude. These glimpses hinted at a girl who had survived tremendous isolation, learning the ways of the wild as instinctively as a wolf cub learns from its mother. She had no human family nearby, yet she exhibited a level of social sophistication, guiding and nurturing her animal companions in a way that suggested deep empathy and emotional intelligence. Henry began leaving small offerings near the forest edge, a bit of food, shiny objects, and blankets, hoping to show her that he meant no harm. At first, she was cautious, sometimes sniffing or examining the gifts from a safe distance before retreating with the wolves. Over days, he noticed subtle changes. She would linger a little longer near the gifts, inspect them more carefully, and even leave behind small tokens of her own, like feathers or stones arranged in curious patterns. Through these silent exchanges, Henry began to feel a tentative connection forming, a bridge between his world of structure and solitude and her realm of instinct and freedom. At the same time, the forest revealed its dual nature to Henry, beautiful and serene, yet dangerous and unpredictable. He encountered bears, slippery streams, and thorny underbrush, all reminders that survival here required skill, patience, and respect. He realized that to understand the girl, he must first understand the wild itself, acknowledging its rules and rhythms without attempting to control them. In doing so, he not only learned about her life but also began confronting his own limitations, fears, and assumptions about humanity and nature. By the end of this period of careful observation, Henry understood one fundamental truth. This girl was not simply a child lost in the woods. She was a bridge between worlds, a living testament to resilience, adaptation, and the profound intelligence of nature. He felt a deepening sense of awe and responsibility, recognizing that his life at Lone Creek Ranch would no longer be a solitary retreat. Something extraordinary had entered his world, and he knew, in his heart, that the forest and the girl who thrived within it was about to change his life forever. Weeks passed, and Henry's cautious observation of the girl began to evolve into something deeper. The initial awe and fear he had felt during their first encounter gradually softened into curiosity and, eventually, a tentative sense of companionship. By now, he understood her routines, the way she foraged at dawn, the subtle signals she gave to her wolf pack, the quiet ritual she performed near the creek where the forest met the pasture. He noticed that she was more than merely surviving. She was thriving, entirely in tune with her surroundings and deeply connected to the natural world. Yet, despite this, there were hints of loneliness in her behavior, a yearning for connection that mirrored his own. Henry realized that the girl was beginning to notice him too. At first, it was subtle, a pause in her movements when he appeared, a tilt of her head in his direction, or the way the wolves would stand at the edge of the forest and watch him. Then small gestures began to emerge. She would cautiously approach the gifts he left, sniffing them and sometimes rearranging them into patterns he could barely understand. One day, he saw her leave a collection of polished stones on the edge of the clearing, as if responding to his offerings in her own silent language. Henry recognized this as a form of communication, tentative but deliberate, and it filled him with both hope and determination. Carefully, he began to experiment with interaction. Speaking softly and avoiding sudden movements, he tried to teach her simple words, pointing to objects and repeating their names. At first, she mimicked him in bursts of curiosity, repeating sounds that were almost human words but tinged with the wild cadence of the forest. He laughed quietly at her attempts, feeling a connection form across the gap of years and experience. In turn, she taught him, showing him how to move silently through underbrush, how to read the subtle signs of the forest, and even how to interpret the wolves' signals. Each lesson was a revelation, a reminder that intelligence and wisdom were not confined to human norms, but could take countless forms in the natural world. Despite the progress, the barrier between them was still significant. Trust had to be earned in measured increments, and Henry knew any misstep could shatter the fragile bond. The wolves remained a constant reminder of the delicate balance. They circled him warily, their eyes keen and calculating, yet gradually their posture softened. acknowledging him as a non-threatening presence, a potential ally rather than a predator. The girl, too, began to display subtle signs of comfort sitting closer to the gifts he left, occasionally glancing toward him with recognition in her eyes and even responding to his soft calls with low, tentative sounds that were almost words. As the days wore on, Henry felt an unexpected shift within himself. Loneliness, which had driven him to this remote corner of the world, began to fade. In its place emerged a sense of purpose and connection he had long forgotten existed. The girl, wild and untamed as she was, had become a mirror for his own need for companionship, a bridge that linked his human experience with the raw, instinctual intelligence of the natural world. In teaching her and learning from her, he discovered that communication was more than language. It was patience, respect, and observation. By the end of this period, Henry realized that the girl had begun to trust him, albeit cautiously. Their connection was fragile but real, built on mutual respect, curiosity, and the shared understanding that each relied on the other for more than mere survival. For the first time in decades, Henry felt a sense of belonging and acknowledgement that life, even in the most unexpected forms, could offer companionship, learning, and a profound, transformative bond. The forest, the girl, and the wolves had begun to reshape his solitary existence into something vibrant, unpredictable, and alive. As the bond between Henry and the girl grew stronger, the quiet rhythm of life at Lone Creek Ranch was disrupted by an encroaching danger neither of them had anticipated. One late afternoon, while Henry was repairing a section of the old barn, he noticed unusual activity at the edge of the valley. Dust clouds rose in the distance, accompanied by the faint rumble of engines. Curious and apprehensive, he crept to the ridge overlooking the pasture and saw a convoy of trucks and machinery descending toward the ranch. A group of developers had set their sights on the property, intending to clear the forest and transform the land into a commercial venture. Henry's first instinct was disbelief. The ranch had been abandoned for decades. How could anyone have discovered it now? But as he watched, the reality sank in. Signs were posted along the boundary, marking the beginning of construction and claiming legal ownership of the surrounding land. The developers seemed indifferent to the forest, the wildlife, or the history embedded in the valley. Their presence was a direct threat not only to Henry's new sanctuary, but also to the girl who had made this wild land her home. Meanwhile, the girl, who had been watching from the tree line with her wolves, sensed the intrusion immediately. Her reaction was instinctive and urgent. She circled a perimeter of the forest, moving silently between the trees, sending subtle signals to the pack. The wolves responded instantly, their bodies tensing and eyes narrowing, ready to protect her at a moment's notice. Henry watched in awe as she coordinated their movements almost effortlessly, directing the pack with gestures and low, urgent calls that he couldn't fully understand. It was clear that any confrontation with these intruders could become dangerous very quickly. Henry realized that this threat required both caution and courage. The developers were numerous and well-equipped, and confronting them directly could have disastrous consequences. Yet he could not abandon the girl or the sanctuary they had come to share. He began to devise a plan, relying on his understanding of the terrain, the forest, and the girl's unique skills. Using natural barriers, hidden trails, and his knowledge of the land, Henry hoped to slow the intruders, buying time to protect the forest and the girl's home. Over the next several days, tension built. Henry and the girl began working in tandem, though their communication was still limited. She would scout silently, signaling him with hand gestures or subtle movements, while he prepared makeshift defenses and devised strategies to keep the developers at bay. The wolves remained an integral part of this alliance, acting as both scouts and deterrents, their presence a constant reminder of the girl's deep connection to the wild. Amid this looming conflict, Henry felt a new sense of responsibility. The girl's safety, the wolves' survival, and the sanctity of the ranch were now inextricably linked to his own actions. He realized that his solitary retreat had transformed into a shared mission, a fight to preserve not just land, but life, freedom, and the fragile trust that had begun to blossom between him and the girl. The coming days would test their courage, their ingenuity, and the strength of the bond they had built in the quiet, untamed wilderness of Lone Creek Ranch. The peaceful rhythm of life at Lone Creek Ranch shattered when the developers began encroaching more aggressively. Trucks rumbled through nearby dirt roads, surveying teams marked trees for removal, and the distant hum of chainsaws grew louder each day. Henry knew that passive observation would no longer suffice. Action was necessary to protect the girl, the wolves, and the fragile sanctuary they had come to call home. Together, he and the girl began orchestrating a defense that relied on a mix of clever strategy, knowledge of the land, and the uncanny instincts of her wolf companions. The girl, moving like a shadow through the forest, took the lead in scouting. Henry observed from hidden vantage points, learning how she could silently navigate steep slopes, dense underbrush, and rushing streams without leaving a trace. She communicated with the wolves in subtle ways, ear flicks, low growls, and precise gestures, and they responded instantly, forming a coordinated unit. Henry realized that the pack's loyalty and intelligence were extraordinary. The girl could manipulate the terrain and the natural behavior of the wolves to outsmart the intruders without ever revealing her own location. As the developers advanced, Henry began implementing his own defensive measures. Using his familiarity with the property, he set up clever traps and barriers, logs precariously balanced to roll when disturbed, brush piles that concealed pits, and false trails to mislead the machines. Every tactic he employed was designed to delay, frustrate, and intimidate the intruders while minimizing harm to animals and the forest. The girl added her own touches, whistles, and soft calls that guided the wolves to intercept specific areas, creating a network of natural surveillance that made the forest seem alive and threatening to those unfamiliar with it. One afternoon, a confrontation escalated. A small group of workers approached the edge of the clearing, unaware of the traps or the silent pack observing them. Suddenly, logs toppled. Alarms in the form of rustling branches startled them, and the wolves emerged with low, threatening growls. The girl moved fearlessly among them, her body language commanding the pack as if she were an equal among wolves rather than a human. Henry watched in awe as she displayed remarkable courage and strategy, outmaneuvering the intruders at every turn. The clash was not without tension. Henry feared for the girl's safety, knowing that one misstep could result in serious harm. Yet he was also inspired by her bravery and ingenuity. He understood that the forest itself had become a character in this struggle, a living, breathing ally that, with the girl and the wolves, could defend itself against the encroaching threat. Together, the trio man-girl and wolves created a formidable defense that relied on intuition, observation, and trust rather than brute force alone. By the end of the day, the developers had retreated temporarily, disoriented and unnerved by the coordinated resistance. For Henry, the victory was bittersweet. The fight was far from over, but it had solidified the bond between him and the girl. He realized that survival in the wild required more than courage. It required mutual trust, understanding, and respect for the forces of nature. In protecting the girl and her wolf family, Henry discovered a renewed sense of purpose. He was no longer just a lonely old man seeking refuge. He was a guardian, a partner in a delicate balance between humanity and wilderness, ready to face whatever challenges the outside world might bring next. After the skirmish with the developers, a profound shift settled over Lone Creek Ranch. The forest, the girl, and the wolves had endured the first real test of their harmony with Henry, and in the aftermath, something remarkable occurred. The fragile trust and tentative companionship that had been forming between Henry and the girl strengthened into a bond that was unshakable. The girl, once wary and elusive, now regarded him with recognition and a quiet acceptance. And Henry, for the first time in decades, felt that he was truly part of a living, breathing family. The days following the confrontation were quieter, though no less vital. The girl began to allow Henry closer access, letting him witness her daily routines without fear. She would emerge from the forest at dawn to gather water from the creek, the wolves trailing obediently behind. And Henry observed her methods, learning not only how to move silently through the woods, but also how to attune himself to the rhythms of the forest. Their interactions became more intentional. He taught her simple words and phrases, and she reciprocated with gestures and sounds that expressed meaning in her own unique way. Through these exchanges, Henry began to understand that communication was not confined to speech alone. It was shared attention, mutual understanding, and respect. The wolves, too, had become more comfortable with Henry's presence. Initially wary and defensive, they now recognized him as a non-threatening ally. They would allow him to approach cautiously, their ears flicking and tails lowering in acknowledgement rather than warning. Henry marveled at the depth of their intelligence and the girl's innate ability to communicate with them. In a sense, she had taught him a new language, one that bridged the gap between humans and animals, civilization and wilderness. With the immediate threat of the developers temporarily neutralized, Henry also took steps to improve the ranch itself. Overgrown fences were repaired, small vegetable gardens were planted, and the old farmhouse began to regain its structural integrity. Yet for all the work he did, he found that his true satisfaction came from the quiet moments shared with the girl and the wolves. Observing them at play, seeing her hunt small game, and noticing the subtle ways she guided and nurtured her pack. These moments offered a profound sense of connection, filling the void that had haunted Henry since the loss of his wife. Emotionally, Henry felt a transformation. The solitude that had once seemed like a refuge now felt incomplete without the companionship of the girl and her wolves. He realized that family was not defined by blood or societal expectations, but by trust, loyalty, and mutual care. The girl, in turn, began to navigate the delicate balance between her wild instincts and her growing connection to Henry. She learned to allow moments of vulnerability without fear, and Henry, in response, became patient and protective, understanding that trust had to be nurtured slowly and consistently. By the end of this period, Henry and the girl had created a harmonious rhythm, human and wild, past and present, solitude and companionship, all coexisting in the valley of Lone Creek Ranch. The bond between them was no longer tentative, it was a living, resilient connection forged through respect, shared challenges, and the quiet understanding that, together, they had created a family unlike any other. In this shared sanctuary, both human and wilderness had found something they had been seeking for years: trust, belonging, and a home. With the immediate threat from the developers finally repelled, life at Lone Creek Ranch settled into a rhythm that was both serene and vibrant. The forest, once a place of mystery and danger, had become a true sanctuary, a living, breathing world in which Henry, the girl, and her wolf companions coexisted in harmony. For Henry, the solitude he had once sought in the abandoned ranch had transformed into a profound sense of purpose and connection. He was no longer merely an observer of nature. He was a guardian, a companion, and in many ways, a teacher. The girl, who had grown up surviving entirely on her own, had flourished in this new chapter of her life. Though wildness remained the core of her identity, she had begun to embrace aspects of human interaction under Henry's gentle guidance. She learned to navigate the delicate balance between her instincts and the trust she now placed in him. The wolves, ever loyal, continued to follow her lead, their presence a constant reminder of the girl's deep connection to the untamed world. Together, the trio man, girl, and pack formed a family defined not by convention, but by mutual respect, trust, and shared survival. Henry and the girl spent their days tending to the ranch, gradually restoring the old farmhouse and clearing sections of the land for sustainable cultivation. Henry showed her how to plant vegetables, care for small livestock, and make basic repairs to the house. She, in turn, shared with him the knowledge of the forest, how to track animals, forage edible plants, and read subtle signs in the landscape that most humans would overlook. Their relationship was no longer one of teacher and student. It had evolved into a partnership, a collaborative existence that relied on each other's strengths and insights. As the seasons passed, Henry observed the girl growing more confident, not just in the forest, but in her understanding of the world beyond it. She began exploring the edges of human interaction, cautiously venturing into nearby towns to observe from a distance, learning patterns of human behavior, and slowly adapting certain skills while never relinquishing her independence. She remained wild at heart, but she now had the knowledge and choice to navigate both the human and natural worlds. The wolves remained her constant companions, a bridge between the wilderness and the emerging aspects of her human experience. Emotionally, Henry felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known. Loneliness, which had driven him to the ranch, had given way to deep connection and responsibility. He had become part of something larger than himself, a living ecosystem of life, learning, and companionship. In turn, the girl had found safety, guidance, and the rare opportunity to form a bond with a human without compromising her independence or instincts. Their trust was mutual, tested through shared trials and solidified by respect and care. By the end of the year, Lone Creek Ranch was no longer abandoned. It was alive with laughter, the movement of the wolves, the rustling of leaves, and the quiet hum of human and wildlife coexisting. Henry and the girl had forged a family that defied societal expectations, a sanctuary where the untamed could thrive alongside careful stewardship. The ranch had become a place of legend, a story of resilience, trust, and harmony. In the heart of the forest, they had created something extraordinary, a life where both human and wild could flourish together, a home shaped by courage, love, and the enduring spirit of nature.